Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fourth chapter of the fifth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being Relation of the Three Arms. The text follows. We shall only speak of the three principal arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. We must be excused for making the following analysis, which belongs more to tactics, but is necessary to give distinctness to our ideas. The combat is of two kinds, which are essentially different: the destructive principle of fire and the hand-to-hand or personal combat. This latter, again, is either attack or defense. As we here speak of elements, attack and defense are to be understood in a perfectly absolute sense. Artillery, obviously, acts only with the destructive principle of fire, cavalry only with personal combat, infantry with both. In close combat, the essence of defense consists in standing firm as if rooted to the ground. The essence of the attack is movement. Cavalry is entirely deficient in the first quality. On the other hand, it possesses the latter in an especial manner. It is therefore only suited for attack. Infantry has especially the property of standing firm, but is not altogether without mobility. From this division of the elementary forces of war into different arms, we have as result the superiority and general utility of infantry as compared with the other two arms, from its being the only arm which unites in itself all the three elementary forces. A further deduction to be drawn is that the combination of the three arms leads to a more perfect use of the forces by affording the means of strengthening at pleasure either the one or the other of the principles which are united in an unalterable manner in infantry. The destructive principle of fire is in the wars of the present time plainly beyond measure the most effective. Nevertheless, the close combat man to man is just as plainly to be regarded as the real basis of combat. For that reason, therefore, an army of artillery only would be an absurdity in war, but an army of cavalry is conceivable, only it would possess very little intensity of force. An army of infantry alone is not only conceivable, but also much the strongest of the three. The three arms therefore stand in this order in reference to independent value: infantry, cavalry, artillery. But this order does not hold good if applied to the relative importance of each arm when they are all three acting in conjunction. As the destructive principle is much more effective than the principle of motion, therefore the complete want of cavalry would weaken an army less than the total want of artillery. An army consisting of infantry and artillery alone would certainly find itself in a disagreeable position if opposed to an army composed of all three arms. But if what it lacked in cavalry was compensated for by a proportionate increase of infantry, it would still, by some somewhat different mode of acting, be able to do very well with its tactical economy. Its outpost service would cause some embarrassment. It would never be able to pursue a beaten enemy with great vivacity, and it must make a retreat with greater hardships and efforts. But these inconveniences would still never be sufficient in themselves to drive it completely out of the field. On the other hand, such an army opposed to one composed of infantry and cavalry would be able to play a very good part, while it is hardly conceivable that the latter could keep the field at all against an army made up of all three arms. Of course, these reflections on the relative importance of each single arm result only from a consideration of the generality of events in war, where one case compensates another, and therefore it is not our intention to apply the truth thus ascertained to each individual case of a particular combat. A battalion on outpost service or on a retreat may perhaps choose to have with it a squadron in preference to a couple of guns. A body of cavalry with the horse artillery sent in rapid pursuit of or to cut off a flying enemy wants no infantry, etc. If we summarize the results of these considerations, they amount to this: 1. That infantry is the most independent of all of the three arms. 2. Artillery is quite wanting in independence. 3. Infantry is the most important in the combination of the three arms. 4. cavalry can the most easily be dispensed with. 5. A combination of the three arms gives the greatest strength. Now, if the combination of all three gives the greatest strength, it is natural to inquire what is the best absolute proportion of each, but that is a question which it is almost impossible to answer. If we could form a comparative estimate of the cost of organizing in the first instance, and then provisioning and maintaining each of the three arms, and then again of the relative amount of service rendered by each in war, we should obtain a definite result which would give the best proposition in the abstract. But this is little more than play of the imagination. The very first term in the comparison is difficult to determine. That is to say, one of the factors, the cost in money, is not difficult to find, but another, the value of men's lives, in a computation which no one would readily try to solve by figures. Also, the circumstance that each of the three arms chiefly depends on a different element of strength in the state, infantry on the number of the male population, cavalry on the number of horses, artillery on available financial means, introduces into the calculation of some heterogeneous conditions, the overruling influence of which may be plainly observed in the great outlines of the history of different people at various periods, has, however, for other reasons we cannot altogether dispense with some standard of comparison. Therefore, in place of the whole of the first term of the comparison, we must take only that of one of its factors which can be ascertained, namely, the cost in money. Now, on this point, it is sufficient for our purpose to assume that, in general, a squadron of 150 horsemen, a battalion of infantry 800 strong, a battery of artillery consisting of 8 6-pounders, cost nearly the same, both as respects the expense of formation and of maintenance. With regard to the other member of the comparison, that is, how much service the one arm is capable of rendering as compared with the others, it is much less easy to find any distinct quantity. The thing might perhaps be possible if it depended merely on the destroying principle, but each arm is destined to its own particular use, therefore has its own particular sphere of action, which again is not so distinctly defined that it might not be greater or less through modifications only in the mode of conducting the war without causing any decided disadvantage. We are often told of what experience teaches on this subject, and it is supposed that military history affords the information necessary for a settlement of the question. But everyone must look upon all that as nothing more than a way of talking which, as it is not derived from anything of a primary and necessary nature, does not deserve attention in an analytical examination. Now, although a fixed ratio and representing the best proportion between the three arms is conceivable, but it is an X which it is impossible to find, a mere imaginary quantity, still it is possible to appreciate the effects of having a great superiority or great inferiority in one particular arm, as compared with the same arm in the enemy's arm. Artillery increases the destructive principle of fire. It is the most redoubtable of arms, and its want therefore diminishes very considerably the intensive force of an army. On the other hand, it is the least movable, consequently makes an army more unwieldy. Further, it always requires a force for its support, because it is incapable of close combat if it is too numerous, so that the troops appointed for its protection are not able to resist the attacks of the enemy at every point. It is often lost, and from that follows a fresh disadvantage, because of the three arms it is the only one which in its principal parts, that is guns and carriages, the enemy can soon use against us. Cavalry increases the principle of mobility in an army. If too few in number, the brisk flame of the elements of war is thereby weakened, because everything must be done slower on foot. Everything must be organized with more care. The rich harvest of victory, instead of being cut with a scythe, can only be reaped with a sickle. An excess of cavalry can certainly never be looked upon as a direct diminution of the combatant force, as an organic disproportion, but it may certainly be so indirectly on account of the difficulty of feeding that arm, and also if we reflect that instead of a surplus of 10,000 horsemen not required, we might have 50,000. So a very limpid chapter that we also read just for one half, because otherwise it would be too long, in which von Clausewitz analyzes quite clearly the relation between the various arms. That is, of course, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, in order of importance, as we will see now, generally speaking. This order is also very quite important to understand in a universal sense. Once again, this is not von Clausewitz speaking of early 19th century warfare. Not necessarily, right? When he makes examples to make us understand something, he refers naturally to measures of his own times, but still to make us understand how the thing could vary from the universal standard. These intrinsic qualities of infantry, cavalry, and artillery are something that objectively remain unvaried, historically speaking, because the quality that they have is intrinsic. And when we try to say, well, but today's artillery is mobile, right? Yeah, it was mobile also at the time, telling you the truth. Not in the same, exactly in the same way, especially as far as the fire employment was concerned, but still, yes, these things do vary over time. It's interesting because ahead in the chapter, von Clausewitz even talks about the Middle Ages, and says something like, it's usually believed that in the Middle Ages cavalry was more quantitatively. It's not true. It had always remained basically the same measure. And also relatively to artillery, we could observe how even at technological variations, essentially its role has remained the same, right? Because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about firearms or other artillery in the past as in the present, the cost that is, the most noticeable of also, say, properly the weight of this arm in as far as you can bring it on the field practically, so the availability of it, but it is always subordinated in a way to the use of the other arms, right? Artillery cannot win alone against infantry in a way, not even if you have. Here we should open an important digression on doctrine, but I avoid it because it's always the same old story. Right, you always find the person who comes up by saying, but look at what a machine gun could do in World War I, as if that was kind of an absolute standard. What machine gun fire you can consider it as artillery, fundamentally. In some cases, think about the mitrailleuse. That was specifically the first repetition machine gun. Practically invented 40 years before, but up to that point it was so powerful that it hadn't found an adequate doctrine of employment, and so it started functioning properly from the 1870s, only in the 1910s. But the point is that World War I is contextual, right? It's not that the machine gun was in place there for no reason, like it could be in any other territory, in any other context, with any other army function exactly the same way, right? Otherwise, you would assume that every army in the world was the same, and that the person who doesn't use that tactic is just an imbecile, and the outcomes of engagements actually proves otherwise. So you say, well, you clearly understand that there's not an absolute categorical value of that specific weapon. And von Clausewitz is particularly clear about this. He says, here we can say how, what are the intrinsic characteristics of these arms, and we can even make a calculation of the material cost that it takes to bring them on the field. But fundamentally, we cannot say much more than that as far their employment is concerned, because there are situations in which they really vary a lot. Depending on the contingency, which you can't properly measure it, and also what is the importance? Also, why should you evaluate one of these arms, one unit over another, its equipment over the other, in absolute terms? That varies, and it's not even subjected to concretely rational reasons, or at least not concretely military reasons, because we have seen that here we're talking about the theory of the art of war, but we are excluding, for example, the logistical costs, right? Von Clausewitz here is not specifically talking about that is talking specifically in terms of how to make a gun, not even what it takes to bring it there. So reality always interferes, as we've seen in the play, from many directions. From the political one, it controls war at every given instant, the environment, and generally speaking, whatever varies from the simple availability of the armed forces, right? So what you have to employ, right? And that's what makes you arrive to the matter of doctrine. That is, it's not that these arms are out there without just they function individually. No, there is a combination of them that is in fact doctrinal, but that also varies over time, and that changes in a way, and that cannot be always employed identically. These are all things von Clausewitz actually touches here if you have listened to the text, and they are particularly important. And I promise at some point now we will, hopefully at least, we will try to make some videos about, theoretical videos, let's be honest about the thing, of even just explaining what is doctrine and how can we talk about this historically, right? Not just militarily speaking, but most, of course, both of them. But this could be true even just for, engineering, right? Not for the army. But which they even overlap in these cases. So, but whatever. So, reading relation of the three arms, we shall only speak of the three principal arms: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. We must be excused for making the following analysis, which belongs more to tactics, but is necessary to give distinctness to our ideas. The combat is of two kinds, which are essentially different: the destructive principle of fire, and the hand-to-hand combat or personal combat. This distinction is very interesting because objectively shows, let's say, a reality that is proper of warfare since the dawn of it. Because since you can't think of anything you can throw against someone, you're, intrinsic. But it can be everything. Like it can be a javelin, it can be an arrow, right? So we're talking about prehistory and pre-war at some levels even. And that is intrinsically different from closing in and getting the melee to hand-to-hand combat. This distinction is important because von Clausewitz fundamentally says that in spite of the utility, of course, of targeting an enemy at the distance and trying, therefore expanding the possibilities of theoretically not being hit the same way, but at least exploiting more, space and situation to put the enemy in a condition of inferiority, to strike him better, right? And that's why war is asymmetrical by definition. There is nothing like symmetrical warfare, and never been and never will. But still, it's as if this attack, this principle, here he calls the principle of fire and its destruction, unleashed on the enemy, is still like a projection of the hand-to-hand or personal combat in a way, because it gets down fundamentally to the latter in every case, because at some point you basically have to get the enemy, right? It's not just about killing him. As we've seen, most wars are not about exterminating the enemy, it's just about making him give up, right? And even if there are exterminations, this mostly pertain to other realities, and in conditions that are not properly combat, right? You just think about all the massacres of civilians that are taken prisoners, eventually slaughtered, right? That's the hand-to-hand side of the story as far as killing this human being is concerned, unfortunately and horribly. But I care about the fact that von Clausewitz is here probably connecting hand-to-hand or personal combat, as he calls it, to the intrinsic idea of the duel that, as we've seen, is fundamentally war, right, on a narrower scale. And that's fundamentally still the thing, because even with the principle of fire, right, you can't kill a person with an arrow or with a lance, closer range, but it's the effect on the enemies, psychophysical effect on the enemies is the same in a way. So yeah, we just invented new clever ways to kill each other at a distance, but it's not really what makes the absolute difference in a way. It just makes, from a doctrinal point of view, and now we'll see how. And von Clausewitz further distinguishes hand or personal combat in, says, either attack or defense. This is another important distinction because naturally the principle of fire entails, look at linear tactics, right? Essentially these guys stopped in front of them, began to shoot at each other, maybe for hours, right? So, and remaining on the same line. So at that point you're basically, it's not that there was no attack nor defense, but in line of principle, at least conceptually, the idea is that you have these two lines have maintained their position and wear each other out, and then eventually, maybe they can pass through the bayonet, or cavalry kicks in. So at some point you get to that then personal combat in a way. Consider even in this context, bayonet charges were very rare, right? But also quite, and even more, I would say, stressing the point, resolutive, because most of the times, a guy sees that from the other side, the enemy fixing bayonets breaks without waiting for the rout, right? It's such a dramatic psychological impact that it already means you have defeated him. So this distinction is further important because at the end of the day, it's not just about shooting at each other, but also pursuing the enemy, as we've seen. I mean, the object of, so in there is the physicality of literally reaching the enemy, because otherwise, how can you stop him? It's not that you can stop him, but putting him at at gun range. Sometimes you have literally to take him, to surround him, to block his retreat and whatever. So to naturally make him surrender before that happens, but still in the sense that you have arrived to the idea, I come close to you, I kill you at this point. This is also important because naturally you can base warfare on the principle of fire in some ways, because most warfare today is, right? It's quite evident. And missile weapons have always been a very important thing. Less before firearms, but still, right? But warfare still gets down to that attack or defense that entails the personal combat at the end of the day, the physicality of the hand-to-hand combat. And consider that the two things are, like, the principle of fire and hand-to-hand or combat or personal combat are a hybrid, because as we have seen, you can't do both with the same unit, right? But just the doctrine may rely more or less on this standing firm and just shooting and shooting and shooting, and until the enemy is worn out, you are worn out for that matter. But still, it's the concept that is separated, because these are intrinsically different ways of fighting, albeit they coexist in the same person potential, right? Even the unit or its equipment. So von Clausewitz also says, as we here speak of elements, attack and defense are to be understood in a perfectly absolute sense. And this is what literally he meant. Artillery obviously acts only with the destructive principle of fire, right? The crew can tactically charge at some point or defend, but it's not meant to do it. Artillery is made to work together with the other arms. Cavalry only with personal combat, because objectively cavalry, even in here you say, okay, well, but there can't be riflemen on horseback or horse archers, whatever. Yes, but here we're still talking about the cavalry side of it, because the rifleman can dismount and do the same exact thing. But when it mounts, it's still cavalry, and cavalry can be used in that sense, only with that sense of personal combat, of reaching the enemy. It's lower. And infantry with both, because infantry is intrinsically, even in here, independently of how it's equipped, capable of performing the both things, while cavalry, for example, cannot defend, by definition. Cavalry cannot defend, only by dismounting, which is not cavalry anymore. So von Clausewitz says, in close combat, the essence of defense consists in standing firm, as if rooted to the ground. This is also very important from a military historical point of view. Every time you think about a defense, never think it's like flexible in the sense that the single trooper is meant just to make back and forth. I mean, you can do that, but at that point you're not properly defending the ground, but you're just doing it because you presume that if you close the distance, you're going to be overwhelmed. So at a point, this is typical of the skirmisher, and the skirmisher is light infantry. Light infantry, by definition, is defined by the fact that it cannot hold the ground against the heavy infantry or cavalry. Every time you see, I don't know, you have to take a cavalry charge, you have to stay fixed, firm, and do not move at all, right? Because that's the intrinsicality of defense. The essence of the attack instead is movement, and this is, pretty much understandable. Cavalry is entirely deficient in the first quality, as we have seen. On the other hand, it possesses the latter in a special manner. That is, cavalry cannot defend, but when it attacks, it attacks like hell, in a way that the infantry can't. It is therefore only suited for attack. Infantry has especially the property of standing firm, but is not altogether without mobility. Right, so the moral of the story, as we often said also elsewhere, is that infantry has this multiple roles achievable. And of course, often with less, necessarily with more numbers, so it's obvious that a cavalryman costs more, usually, on average, than an infantryman. But the point is that still, the intrinsicality of mounted combat and of foot combat has these qualities. And this is what we're looking at now, which is in line of, principle in general. Which doesn't mean, in practice it's different. It means in practice it's the best scientific approximation you can make. So it is generally true. And it's already an enormous much that we can define that. Because believe me, many people just don't even care about these ideas. That they think, reality is like in video games. They have the difficulty to realize what even the physical side of the story is entailed. But von Clausewitz goes on and says, from this division of the elementary forces of war in two different arms, we have a result. As a result, the superiority and general utility of infantry as compared with the other two arms, which we just said. From its being the only arm which unites in itself all the three elementary forces. A further deduction to be drawn is that the combination of the three arms leads to a more perfect use of the forces, by affording the means of strengthening at pleasure either the one or the other of the principles which are united in an unalterable manner in infantry. Right. So the versatility of infantry is something to take very seriously into consideration. Then, the destructive principle of fire is in the wars of the present time plainly beyond measure the most effective. Present times, so here, yes, we are in early 19th, late 18th, Napoleonic warfare, as far as von Clausewitz is concerned. So, yes, musketry fire is objectively what makes the most on the field. Right, literally the highest casualties are taken through musketry fire. You would think it's artillery, think cavalry. No, it's objectively, in terms of destructive capacity, considered mass, most of the work is done effectively by infantry and their guns. Nevertheless, the close combat, von Clausewitz writes, man to man, is just as plainly to be regarded as the real basis of combat, as we were saying before. For that reason, therefore, an army of artillery only would be an absurdity in war. But an army of cavalry is conceivable, and we know it, only it would possess very little intensity of force. this is another important picture. That is in terms, recently we began to discuss this thing that I came, with the idea, what is a civilization? And there are certain people who make relativism about it. They say, every culture is different, so you can, every culture is different. Not every civilization is different. There is a very big divide, by even just in meaning between what a civilization and cultures are. The cultures are not comparable, I agree. But civilizations are, right? And not that I am a fan of making hierarchies of civilization, but if you wonder why, for example, the great civilizations of sedentary Eurasia have never been taken over by the steppe ones, unless the steppe ones basically sedentarized immediately. By the way, think about the Mongols, but also why a Roman Empire existed, and I don't know, the Sarmatians were always at the outskirts of it without accomplishing much, or Attila couldn't rule anything like a Roman Empire, and it didn't. Well, that's exactly in part related to the fact that as nomadic cultures, let's call them this way, they had mostly also armies of cavalry that, as far as holding ground is concerned, it's not that they didn't have infantry, don't get me wrong, but in there you can see, in comparison of these civilizations, a big divide, a big weakness after all. Aside from propagandistic, fictional reasons, the terrible, rulers of the steppes that come and are strong and everybody fears them. Well, in reality, they were always the weaker side. And this is proven in part by the fact that they also had exclusively or virtually all mounted armies. Why? Because they were used to fight in realities that, in fact, didn't even, build much in terms of, field fortifications, for example. Not that they didn't have it, but the idea is that if you can overwhelm with an army of cavalry an entire tribe, is usually because this tribe doesn't have enough resources to entrench enough somewhere. Because otherwise, which is a reason also why, for example, the Mongols probably didn't push forward, aside from the fact that they had to come back for political reasons, but or their own, but push into Europe. Right? Do you really see the Mongols stopping in Germany to besiege any damn stinky Moat and Bailey castle? Right? At that time castles were a bit more advanced, but the average wasn't. But they literally would have had to do that, and how much that would have costed, and how much would they need eventually to build for? And this is a very important thermometer, indicator of what properly even the permeability of certain realities is. That is not that it's because these armies were largely mounted, that therefore we have to think that the Mongols were not a civilization. Of course they were. They had a hell of probably the strongest army at the time, no doubt, considering also the embarrassing European defeats, series of the embarrassing series of European disasters every time they faced the Mongols. But still, that doesn't mean, because other factors interplay, that the thing could continue. Right? The Mongols eventually settled, in all the various, think about China, think about Iran, it eventually became those people. The ones of the steppes remained the ones of the steppes. Like, it's not that there's been an improvement in civilization. So when you feel offended because you want to prove that your ancestor was this great evolution and everything is in perspective, you can make relativism about, it's not true, it's only historiographical fiction, that, I don't know, in some places in Europe, the ancient world were just villages, nothing more. Well, just consider what even certain indicators are about the compositions of the army. Just consider the effort, just consider the mere amount of resources could be concentrated in a given reality, and you realize that behind that there is a political and social face that it's not a matter of personal opinion. I know that people like conspiracy theories and to deny history also because they don't know it, but here we make the point, von Clausewitz makes the brilliant point, that you can even have an army of all cavalry, but that will have some weaknesses intrinsic to it, for which if they don't dismount and learn to be good infantrymen, which I repeat, also in the steppes did exist, but they weren't in many cases as developed as in other realities, the question is you will have serious tactical problems to cope, and strategically as a consequence to cope with other realities, right? Why did many peoples stop simply in front of the walls of Constantinople? Guess why? Right. That's it. It sounds banal, it sounds a bit too mechanistic, maybe as an explanation, but take it as an indicator. That's the point I wanted to do. So here we were talking about, yes, von Clausewitz says properly that an army made entirely of cavalry will possess very little intensity of force. Picture it fluidly, plastically, right? Consider what an army with all three well-combined arms, proportion arms, can achieve over one that is literally just of cavalry. It's not that the more you have what appears, the bulkiest thing, it's necessarily the best. No, in this case, it loses actually a lot of intensity of force, because the force is not about the mere mathematical sum of the physical forces of the single individuals or units. The force is how much you can combine these arms, right? And definitely with an army of cavalry, you can't accomplish very much against a civilized power that can't provide dramatic complexity in that, and that's exactly what happened in the history of mankind. And by degrees, because of course there's never been like an army of exclusively of cavalry, right? The greater becomes the more it's impossible fundamentally. But von Clausewitz eventually goes on and says a further deduction to be drawn is that the combination of the three arms leads to a more perfect use of the forces. It's not about how much force you have, but how well you use it. By affording the means of strengthening at pleasure either the one or the other of the principles which are united in an unalterable manner in infantry. And von Clausewitz says also, an army of infantry alone is not only conceivable, but also much the strongest of the three. The three arms therefore stand in this order in reference to independent value: infantry, cavalry, artillery. But this order does not hold good if applied to the relative importance of each arm when they will all three acting in conjunction, as the destructive principle is much more effective than the principle of motion. Therefore the complete want of cavalry would weaken an army, less than the total want of artillery. We've seen naturally that this pertains to the quality of the arm in general terms. That is to say, cavalry is overall more important than artillery, right, as an arm. But if we consider, for example, in the specific of Napoleonic War, if you take away artillery, well, from an army, instead of taking away all cavalry, well, artillery altogether will have been a much more important element to be taken away. But why? Because it's that specific proportion of artillery in the time that objectively had a hell of a role. So that cavalry, yes, think about in relation to infantry, is not this dramatic. It's not that it wipes it out like it could be for the 13th century. The point is therefore that the importance of the various arms does change over time in relative terms. It's just that the intrinsic capacities of them contemplate this, different roles, different possibilities. And von Clausewitz writes, an army consisting of infantry and artillery alone would certainly find itself in a disagreeable position if opposed to an army composed of all three arms. But if what it lacked in cavalry was compensated for by a proportionate increase of infantry, it would still, by a somewhat different mode of acting, be able to do very well with its tactical economy. So this is banal, right? You increase the numbers, so yeah, this proves how relative the application eventually becomes. Still, you may have this army without cavalry, but if Napoleonic times you have enough infantry, you can even surpass the importance of cavalry in that regard. So it's not the want of a single arm that necessarily makes the difference. It depends on which measure it is, right? It will make the difference, but it will not necessarily, and not nearly, sometimes even be decisive. Excuse me, I drink a little. So, Von Clausewitz makes an example, says its outpost service would cause some embarrassment. It would never be able to pursue a beaten enemy with great vivacity, and it must make a retreat with a greater hardships and efforts. But these inconveniences would still never be sufficient in themselves to drive it completely out of the field, right? You see how interesting this is. We're still talking about the army of just infantry and artillery without cavalry. Yeah, this army would have serious problems, right? For example, to pursue the enemy. The other day we were talking about, the Battle of Courtrai, right? Not much field artillery in Middle Ages, and there wasn't there, apparently. Or maybe there was, who knows, the Flemish besieging the castle maybe have used catapults even against French cavalry, who knows, but it was not. But still, right, that deficit was not a big deal as far as the result of the battle was, and alone, without specific numbers, without specific contingencies, it doesn't say much, right? For Clausewitz says, on the other hand, such an army opposed to one composed of infantry and cavalry would be able to play a very good part, while it is hardly conceivable that the latter could keep the field at all against an army made up of all three arms, right? So if definitely you have cavalry and infantry, maybe you can pursue better, but the point is that if you meet an enemy with all three arms in good proportion, as much as yours presumably are, well, you will probably suffer tendentially, right, of this, and you will have difficulty to cope with the hammering of the artillery. But it's all relative. Von Clausewitz says, of course, these reflections on the relative importance of each single arm result only from a consideration of the generality of events in war, where one cause compensates another, and therefore it is not our intention to apply the truth thus as certain to each individual case of a particular combat. So this is what he has exemplified, and we were talking about. A battalion on outpost service or on a retreat may perhaps choose to have with it a squadron in preference to a couple of guns. A body of cavalry with horse artillery sent in rapid pursuit of or to cut off a flying enemy wants no infantry, etc. So there are specific situations in which you even deliberately leave an arm behind because you can't do well enough with that combined force. Always remember, this is not about how strong you are, but how you use your force. And therefore, you playing with the quantities, with the proportions, relations, depending on what you need to do, you can easily have good units that are composed maybe even just one arm only, right? Or with two, without the third, but still combining enough force that is okay in that specific sector, while employing maybe the remaining arm more usefully somewhere else at the same time. So von Clausewitz then says, if we summarize the results of these considerations, they amount to this, which is 1. That infantry is the most independent of the three arms, right? They can do a bit of everything, and especially defend well. 2. Artillery is quite wanting in independence. Yeah, they can hammer the enemy, but if they are without the other arms, they can't do much. Or one of the, let's say, not necessarily one of the two, but cavalry cannot defend, right? So, and artillery cannot defend, right? Unless they use, you would say the mitraille, yeah. But if you go around, it's not artillery has capability to cope, I don't know, with cavalry or to infantry with this dynamism. So they're the most vulnerable at all. So generally speaking, artillery is good when it's close to infantry, right? And that's how it's also usually employed. 3. Infantry is the most important in the combination of the three arms, which derives from what we have seen and is connected to the first point. Then 4. Cavalry can the most easily be dispensed with. So of all the arms objectively, cavalry is not the least important, but it's the one that is more easily replaceable in a way, right? 5. A combination of the three arms gives the greatest strength. So once again, it's not how much force you have, but how much you interplay. You use all the forces combined in an effective manner, which is basically what warfare is in a nutshell. Then von Clausewitz says, now, if the combination of the three gives the greatest strength, it is natural to inquire what is the best absolute proportion of each, but that is a question which it is almost impossible to answer. If we could form a comparative estimate of the cost of organizing in the first instance, and then provisioning and maintaining each of the three arms, and then again of the relative amount of service rendered by each in war, we should obtain a definite result which would give the best proportion in the abstract. But this is little more than a play of the imagination. The very first term in the comparison is difficult to determine. That is to say, one of the factors, the cost in money, is not difficult to find, but another, the value of men's lives, is a computation which no one will readily try to solve by figures, right? So this is yet another proof that numerical proportions as abstraction guidelines is not good in the theory of the art of war. Doctrine is one thing because that goes in many ways in parallel with the concept of let's say of symmetry, right? The more armies are symmetric, which they never fully are, but the more doctrine is effective if it is naturally scientifically determined. The point though is that naturally everything varies dramatically even when there is a condition of symmetry in the armed forces, because just maybe the ground messes that proportion completely up. So what von Clausewitz is saying, okay, were we to remain just in general terms, we could make account of how much a single arm costs. That we will see in a while, for at least his own times. But when you, aside from what he says specifically, what value do you give to men's lives, right? And this is not just a rhetorical question, because naturally also men have cynically a price. And yet they're something different from an arm, right? They are a resource that you're employing in ways that eventually interfere with so many other aspects that are not strictly military, that you cannot pretend that how you will concretely employ your armored forces is based simply of because they cost a certain amount. You may not have them readily available anymore, right? That's what von Clausewitz eventually says here. But it messes up, generally speaking, the whole computation, given how the country is, the state, the policy, the society. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, also the circumstance that each of the three arms chiefly depends on a different element of strength in the state, infantry on the number of the male population, cavalry on the number of horses, artillery on available financial means, introduces into the calculation some heterogeneous conditions, the overruling influence of which may be plainly observed in the great outlines of the history of different people at various periods, right? So this changes all the time. Its proportion changes all the time. And even here, von Clausewitz adopts a generalization when he says, that infantry is just about the number of the male population, not much. Cavalry, cavalry on the number of horses, because artillery on the available financial means. In von Clausewitz times, of course, now we have nation states, mass armies, so literally the number of the male population is very important. That if we were to go back in time of the Middle Ages, where most of the, great part of the population was militarized in a way, the point there was not much how many men you could find to fight, right? Which was also important, considering, especially in the early Middle Ages, the demographic amount of people, because literally there were a few people in general. But it was mostly also how do you put them together? Like what are your political means to for example, where do you fund the money, right? That was always more important. Like, it's not, I don't know, in Renaissance warfare, it was difficult to find Europeans apt at arms. It was an overwhelmingly populated continent. The problem was that the polities didn't have enough money on their own to oblige these guys to go to fight. So the financial means, for example, were more important. But you can't say, for example, that also in Napoleonic era they weren't. Of course they were. It's just that in proportion them being lower, because also the state now had fluidified the means of collection of taxes. It still costed a lot, and much more than it had ever been, right, in absolute terms. But still, there was a way to find that money, right? It was easier. Also, the number of horses for cavalry. Yeah, but I mean, even in here, you need horses even just to bring, the supplies, right? The Germans in World War II invaded Russia on muleback, right? Not on motorized vehicles, largely. So what's the deal? Of course, those are mules and not horses, but still there were also lots of horses. And therefore, it would have not been so important in that time as, or maybe not, who knows, I don't know, in medieval times. I mean, there were different relations, right? Different types of resources. So this is exactly what von Clausewitz is making us reason on. How much this varies over time. It's so how there is not a specific proportion. This is the most important point of arms that is perfect, right? Nor in history, in different historical, in absolute terms throughout all history, which is kind of more easier to realize, but not even today. Not even today, because it all depends on who you are fighting, where, how, and that varies over time. There's no army, historically speaking, has ever been identical to another one, right? It's not that, I don't know, the Roman legions were exactly the same number of troops all this time. They varied wildly sometimes. And so this is a bit of wargameism debunked, aside from the fact that when you enter a campaign, eventually your troops are going to run out in many ways, to be worn out, and therefore you don't even, you can start the campaign with a right proportion, but then eventually, and that's also what actually makes military reforms eventually on the long run, because it did happen historically that, I don't know, a military leader went at war with a specific proportion, ratio of strength in mind of the various arms, then these wars basically destroyed that, so that he found himself with completely different ratios, and that on the long run eventually was adopted by people who came later, because they had seen that specific warfare required that. So this is how it really functions, and you understand that the positive need of figuring out this proportion is very low. Then von Clausewitz writes, as, however, for other reasons, we cannot altogether dispense with some standard of comparison, because this is also important from a military point of view. That is, of course, there is some average proportion in our army organization videos. For example, we often say, okay, what was the ratio of infantry of cavalry? I have written an entire chapter of 150 pages at the moment in my work that deals exclusively with that, which is kind of crazy, but at least it objectively shows that in a way you can draw that especially with a diachronical perspective, you can spot changes, which for the history of the art of warfare is very important to look at, because you can literally see not just how the military changes, but how society does. right? How do you explain that? It's because people made war doctrinally, I don't know, in 14th century like that, but no, rather it's you study politics and society, you realize it's because literally, I don't know, there was less infantry because there were less commoner, less, the commoners were less equipped because they were poorer, because maybe the same war had also worn them out. So lots of interesting stuff in that sense. And so he says, therefore, in place of the wall of the first term of the comparison, we must take only that one of its factors which can be ascertained, namely the cost in money. So, as we've seen before, the cost of the various units is practically the most important, and it is practically the most, the easiest one to look up. It's objectively also, in fact, used historically. That is, think about condotta contract, right? You read that, you say, okay, these guys were hired for, this 100 horsemen were hired for this time, for this salary, these conditions. Then you can draw you can study the market, the economy with this all, but that's just a part of it. Clausewitz says, now, on this point, it is sufficient for our purpose to assume that in general, and here he's talking about Napoleonic era, a squadron of 150 horsemen, a battalion of infantry of 800 strong, a battery of artillery consisting of 8 6-pounders, cost nearly the same, right? So this is the equivalent. It's interesting because you see that in Napoleonic times, actually, the importance of cavalry revived and was objectively quite high. And both as respects the expense of formation and of maintenance, right? So it turns also out that the cost of formation and maintenance are basically proportional. This is fascinating, really. And Clausewitz says, with regard to the other member of the comparison, that is, how much service to one arm is capable of rendering as compared with the others, it is much less easy to find any distinct quantity. The thing might perhaps be possible if it depended merely on the destroying principle, right? So it says, so we can look at the cost, and then we can't look at something that, can measure the effectiveness of the employment of this arm. We could look at the level of distraction, that is, how much this arm normally kills or destroys or whatever. But this is exactly the point, that arms are used in different ways. In fact, Von Clausewitz says, but each arm is destined to its own particular use, which is even a deeper concept, right? Because it doesn't say, it's not just about how much stuff you can disintegrate, right? It's that specifically, if you, for example, do not employ an arm in a certain way in a battle, you cannot even employ the other in a certain way. So they are constantly, these factors are constantly interpolated, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's they're constantly intertwined, and they cannot be measured properly. Like it's like we've seen this problem also, for example, in deciding what was the decisive battle in a campaign, or this decisive factor for the outcome of a battle. This is objectively, most of the times, impossible to determine, right? This thing of the ratio of the various arms is kind of more positively maybe analyzable, in the sense that like in the former chapter from Clausewitz saying that Europeans by that time, the Westerns fought mostly in the same identical way, so that there was no difference but the energy and the capability of the commander, the virtue of the army. But literally they're from the greatest power to the smallest, basically all armies are alike. So if you study like an enormous chapter of European warfare like the Napoleonic era, you look at that and you say, well, here we have enough battles to make a chart and see, okay, more or less statistically, how much an arm played its role. It's also what I was saying to you about the chapter I wrote myself. I think I used something like 10,000 quotes, literally, and I don't even know how to fix the thing. I mean, well, this is another problem now. I won't bore you with that. But the point is that, of course, there is apparently some sum you can draw from this. You can objectively see that how an arm is more important than others, the mortality rates, all this stuff, and you can come up with interesting data after all. But it also has, and this is naturally more, this data is more meaningful the largest the troops, the number of troops you're considering, right? Because just as the tactical and strategical outcomes are concerned, the larger the armies are fighting, and the flatter the difference between the performance of the two will become, right? So that astonishingly, disproportionate results, outcomes will occur just from the engagement of smaller units, right? You can have, I don't know, 1 versus 20 victory, right? That's highly unlikely, if not non-existent, at certain other levels. So, anyhow, I think that point was fairly clear. And von Clausewitz says, yes, each arm is destined to its own particular use, therefore has its own particular sphere of action, which again is not so distinctly defined that it might not be greater or less through modifications only in the mode of conducting the war, without causing any decided disadvantage. We are often told, so as you understand, it can even just be a sum of the two. So in an engagement, there's not necessarily an arm that is readily identifiable as, I want that because of cavalry, I want that because of artillery. It's difficult to measure. I mean, literally from an historical point of view, you have no data. You can try to count certain things and to sort out the system, but it depends on how do you count moral factors. We have already talked about this, right? So that's also useless because, as we have seen here, we're talking about essentially military instruments, not even about the people. Here we're talking about, puppets fundamentally. And then in real war, all of these puppets are actually human beings that have all different motivations and reasons to be there. So it complicates itself. Yet statistically, there can be something we can't say. In fact, von Clausewitz writes, we are often told of what experience teaches on this subject, and it is supposed that military history affords the information necessary for a settlement of the question. But everyone must look upon all that as nothing more than a way of talking which, as it is not derived from anything of a primary and necessary nature, does not deserve attention in an analytical examination. This is very important historically speaking, because it's exactly the problem that you pose yourself when you're analyzing certain battles. We've often discussed the importance of the comparative method in the military historical analysis. It's probably the single most important one. And we can observe how naturally a statistic is something. The list of contingents and the outcomes, for example, it can't be statistically read. But if you were to analyze that specific engagement from a tactical point of view, how it happened, well, a new world would disclose within those sources. So it would be unique in its own kind. You would say, yes, this thing ended up like this, which is in the norm, right? Because, I don't know, in the 14th century, cavalry was decisive, yes, usually. But the battle was also won because, I don't know, because that chunk of the enemy army arrived later on the battlefield. Or, I mean, things that have nothing to do specifically, or a very few, virtually nothing, or to do in terms of decisiveness with the, a flat comparison of the various numerical ratios between the arms, right? So that is to be borne in mind, very, very, very important. Borne in mind, very important. Also, von Clausewitz writes, now, although a fixed ratio as representing the best proportion between the three arms is conceivable, but it is an X which it is impossible to find, a mere imaginary quantity, still it is possible to appreciate the effects of having a great superiority or great inferiority in one particular arm as compared with the same arm in the enemy's arm. Because objectively, from that chapter that lists hundreds and hundreds of these things, you realize that, for example, in the 14th century, the more infantry there was, in a way, and more difficult, less likely it is that against a force with more cavalry in a proportionate fashion, that army would be successful, right? This may seem banal, but it's as if you could bet on it, right? And it's exactly what von Clausewitz wants us to reflect on. Is, yes, we can all perceive the positivity of certain data, but let's calm down about its positivistic employment. That is, okay, yeah, we have evidence, that's good, but always remember that this evidence is incomplete, it's difficult to gather and to analyze and to reconnect to certain broader principles, if not at levels that, because this is all for practical use, right? This is as far as just practical use is concerned. You can even point out, I don't know, that there is that proportion, that reciprocality, but until you don't know how to command an army, right? That's not going to be a greatly important thing. As von Clausewitz says, this theory of the art of war is always like having a manual next to you that you have to check when, like, it's needed, like if you need a reference, a point of reference, but not a specific answer for what you are in, right? And everything that pertains to predict, to give specific data, information, etc., that can be always employed, it's pedantic. Most of the times it's worthless, right? And it also generates fundamentally wrong ways of thinking, in a way. So, yes, von Clausewitz says, artillery increases the destructive principle of fire. It is the most redoubtable of arms, and its want therefore diminishes very considerably the intensive force of an arm. Intensive force of an arm. Deriving, that is, from combined arms. Because as we've seen, if artillery had been alone here, it would have been worthless. But exactly because it's combined with the other arms, it becomes very considerably the intensive force of an arm. In great part, right? If you know about just aiding, but about the mean of artillery, right? That's important to keep. That you can't win battles just with artillery, but that helps. That helps as hell. You hammer the enemy, you disorder the enemy, you scare the enemy, you soften the enemy up, right? And then cavalry and infantry have a much easier game. Also, the same thing is done on you, and it's a hell of destructive power. In Napoleonic times, that the power of artillery also increased remarkably, which would lead to another series of historical digressions in Napoleonic warfare. But here, let's spare them for now. Von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, artillery is the least movable, consequently makes an army more unwieldy. So as far as the tactical thing is concerned, well, in part, but also strategically, it brings to some changes that you may, for example, not want. You may decide to be more strategically mobile than tactically powerful, right? Where's the answer? Where's the correct proportion? Every situation is different, and this is just to talk about, because as von Clausewitz said, we're talking just about tactics, but what about strategy? We're missing the whole thing. That also changes the whole game. Further, artillery always requires a force for its support because, as we've seen, it's incapable of close combat. If it is too numerous, so that the troops appointed for its protection are not able to resist the attacks of the enemy at every point, it is often lost. Reflect on it. You can't think, now it will increase so much the number of artillery. Yes, and the one of, the whole weight of the army, and also the one of putting everything together and maybe decreasing the importance of infantry and cavalry for increasing this firepower, that may procure that your artillery to be taken out even more quickly, more easily, so that it will not have had a dramatic importance. And von Clausewitz adds, and from that follows a fresh disadvantage, because of the three arms. Artillery is the only one which in its principal parts, that is guns and carriages, the enemy can soon use against us as well. Have you ever thought about that? That's not men, that's a gun, right? And it doesn't take a lot of men to operate one. While it does take a lot of men to shield artillery with an effective infantry formation. So it's all very risky, and it's all very, as you understand, it's reciprocal. You don't arrive in this system and become the genius that solves the equation, because the equation is already there, and it tells you that it's all a matter of balance, not of the right equation, and this balance varies at all times too. So it's that messed up, right? I mean, it's simpler than it seems, but it's harder than it seems too, right? And very often, as von Clausewitz says, in war, the simplest things are also the hardest, because they are objectively, war is logical, right? It doesn't, rarely very sophisticated plans or complex and articulated ones are the best ones. There is, generally speaking, in war an evident logic. Then however, the whole thing is gonna hold together, and whatever may happen in the general mess of it, with this enormous amount of forces involved, it's something you can't really foresee. There's really not much you can do to solve this positively. I mean, positivistically. Von Clausewitz then says, cavalry increases the principle of mobility in an army. If too few in number, the brisk flame of the elements of war is thereby weakened, because everything must be done slower on foot, and everything must be organized with more care. The rich harvest of victory, instead of being cut with a scythe, can only be reaped with a sickle. This is pretty much clear. An excess of cavalry can certainly never be looked upon as a direct diminution of the combatant force, as an organic disproportion, but it may certainly be so indirectly, on account of the difficulty of fitting that arm, and also if we reflect that instead of a surplus of 100,000 horsemen not required, we might have 50,000 infantry. Alright, for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.